The frost off the loading dock hadn't burned away yet when Corporal Naomi Brandt stepped between the dog and the man in the wool coat. "Sir, this is a secure customs corridor. You need to step back." She said it the way they'd taught her in Petawawa, flat and final, the kind of voice that wasn't supposed to leave room for an answer. The man didn't flinch. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, a battered leather satchel hanging off one shoulder, and looked at her the way you'd look at a kid reciting something she'd memorized but didn't quite believe yet. He was maybe 65. Gray wool coat, the collar worn shiny at the seams. Good boots, the kind that had been resoled more than once. Behind round glasses his eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they didn't move with any urgency at all. He looked like a man waiting for a bus, not a man being threatened with arrest in the bowels of Pearson International. "I'm only passing through," he said. His accent had the soft burr of somewhere east. Cape Breton maybe, sanded down by 30 years of somewhere else. "Gate 14, I came down the wrong escalator. This corridor doesn't connect to Gate 14. Corporal Brandt's jaw was tight. Behind her, 6 Belgian Malinois sat in transport crates along the concrete wall, their handlers crouched beside them doing the slow, practiced business of pre-flight checks. The dogs were headed to Trenton, then onward, a joint deployment exercise nobody in this hallway was supposed to be discussing with civilians, which was exactly why Brandt's pulse was climbing. "I need you to turn around and go back the way you came." The old man's gaze drifted past her shoulder. Not rude, not defiant, just drawn, the way a compass needle gets drawn, helpless against its own nature. He was looking at the dogs. That was when the first one stood up. It was the big male in the third crate, a dog named Talon, according to the laminated card zip-tied to the door, and he came up off his haunches in one motion, ears pinned, a low sound starting in his chest that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a whine. His handler, a young reservist named Singh, put a hand flat against the wire mesh. Hey, easy." Singh's voice cracked a little on the second word. "Talon, sit, sit." Talon didn't sit. He pressed his nose to the crate door, nostrils working, eyes locked on the man in the gray coat, with an intensity that had nothing to do with threat assessment and everything to do with something else, something none of the young handlers in that corridor had a word for. Within 10 seconds, the dog beside him was up too, then the one after that, until all 6 animals were on their feet, pacing in tight, frustrated circles, throwing their weight against crate doors that hadn't budged in 18 months of training. "Settle them," Brandt snapped, not taking her eyes off the old man. Now, the handlers tried. They tried the commands, the soothing tones, the hand signals drilled into muscle memory through 2 years of certification. Nothing worked. It was as if a switch had been thrown somewhere behind the dog's eyes, and the switch didn't answer to rank or training, only to whatever was standing 6 feet away in a coat that smelled faintly of wood smoke and cold air. "Sir, you need to leave." Brandt's hand drifted toward the radio clipped to her vest. "I won't ask you again." "They're not dangerous," the old man said, quietly enough that she almost missed it under the noise. "They're trying to tell you something. I think I know my own unit's dogs better than a man who got lost looking for a coffee shop." He didn't argue. He simply didn't move, and there was something in his stillness that unsettled her more than any argument could have. The stillness of a man who had been shouted at by people far more frightening than a 24-year-old corporal and had simply outlasted them all. 20 feet down the corridor, leaning against a support column with a clipboard she had stopped, pretending to read, Warrant Officer Diane Okonkwo watched the whole thing unfold with the particular patience of someone who had seen a great many young officers make a great many mistakes and had learned, the hard way, not to interrupt the lesson too early. She'd clocked the old man before Brandt had, watched him come down the corridor with a gait that didn't match the stoop of his shoulders, feet placed deliberately, weight carried low and even, the economical walk of a man who'd spent decades being told to move quiet. She'd seen hands like that before too, the right one crisscrossed with thin white scarring along the first 2 knuckles, the unmistakable signature of rope or leather burning through skin at speed. 22 years in security forces taught you to read hands the way some people read faces. And his eyes weren't doing what a lost man's eyes did. They weren't scanning for exit signs or apologetic faces. They were tracking ears, tails, the angle of 6 different spines, cataloging all of it without seeming to try. Okonkwo felt the back of her neck prickle in a way she hadn't felt since basic. The dock filled with noise. Talon slammed his shoulder into the crate door, hard enough to rattle the latch, and the sound set off the others like a string of firecrackers. Barking, the scrabble of claws on metal flooring, handlers shouting over each other in a chorus that accomplished nothing except making everything worse. A customs officer poked his head around the corner, took one look, and disappeared again, presumably to find someone with more stripes on their shoulder than anyone currently present. Corporal Brandt's composure, never especially deep to begin with, cracked clean through. This was her first solo lead on a transport detail. She had briefed it herself, planned the staging, walked the route twice the night before to make sure nothing could go wrong. Now 6 military working dogs were coming apart in a public corridor because of an old man in a thrift store coat, and every second that passed felt like another inch of her career sliding into the drain. That's it. She stepped forward, reaching for his arm. You're coming with me to the security office and we'll sort out who you are and why you're. His hand came up before her fingers closed on the sleeve. Not a strike, not even really a block. Just a palm raised, calm and unhurried, the universal shape for wait. And something about the gesture made her stop, the way you stop at a level crossing even when you can't yet hear the train. He took one step forward, putting himself square in the dog's collective line of sight, and the change in him was immediate and impossible to describe to anyone who hadn't watched it happen. His shoulders, rounded a moment ago under that heavy coat, settled into something straighter. His chin lifted half an inch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move his hands. He simply became, in some way that had nothing to do with size or volume, the only thing in that corridor that mattered. The barking didn't stop all at once. It thinned, the way a crowd thins when someone important walks through it, dog after dog falling quiet and turning its head toward him as though pulled on a string. His pale eyes moved from crate to crate, unhurried, and on each one he seemed to land for just a moment, not appraising, acknowledging, the way you'd nod to men you'd served with. He stopped on Talon last. The big Malinois was still pressed to the door, chest rumbling, but the rage had gone out of it, replaced by something closer to desperate attention. The old man's lips barely moved. Iska. It wasn't loud. It barely carried past the first 2 crates. But it landed in that corridor like a hand closing around a struck bell, and every single dog went down in the same half-second. Not a slow settle, but a full, boneless collapse, heads on paws, tails giving one slow thump against steel floors and then going still. The silence that followed was so complete that somewhere down the hall, a baggage cart's wheel could be heard squeaking against the tile. Nobody moved. Singh had both hands pressed over his mouth. Brandt stood with her arm still half extended toward a sleeve that was no longer there to grab, because the old man had stepped neatly past her without seeming to move quickly at all. What? Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. What did you just do? He looked almost apologetic about it, the way a man looks when he's spilled something at someone else's table. They weren't being aggressive, Corporal. They were panicking. 6 dogs bred and trained over 40 years to recognize a particular kind of authority, and not one handler in this hallway speaking that language to them. It's not your fault. Nobody taught it to you. Nobody's supposed to need it anymore. That's not a command in any field manual I've ever seen. Warrant Officer Okonkwo had crossed the distance without anyone noticing, and she stopped a careful, deliberate 8 feet away. Not the distance you keep from a suspect, but the distance you keep from someone whose rank you haven't confirmed yet, but already suspect outranks your own. I trained under a master handler who mentioned a program out of Gagetown, late 70s. Bloodline conditioning. Said it died with the men who ran it. Something shifted behind the old man's glasses. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition meeting recognition. You have a good teacher, Warrant. Cold Forge, she said, watching his face for the flicker of confirmation, and got it, small as a held breath. That's what he called it. Said the dogs from that line could read a room better than the men handling them. He wasn't wrong. The old man's mouth curved briefly into something that wasn't quite a smile. Though we never called it that ourselves. We just called it the work. Corporal Brandt looked between the two of them, color rising in her face, the particular shame of someone realizing she'd been the loudest person in a room where she understood the least. I don't, she started and stopped and tried again. Sir, who are you? He set his satchel down gently against the wall, as if buying himself a moment, and when he straightened, his eyes had the weight of a man deciding how much of an old debt he owed to honesty. My name's not going to mean anything to you, Corporal, and that's by design. Used to go by Sergeant Major. Doesn't matter what came before the rank. He nodded toward the row of dogs, all 6 still flat and motionless, watching him with an expression that, on a human face, would have been called reverence. What matters is what just happened and why. He explained it plainly, without theater, the way a man explains something he's tired of half-truths covering up. There had been a program, decades back, run out of a training facility, nobody put on maps anymore, an attempt to breed and condition dogs that could read a handler's intent before the handler had finished forming the thought. Dogs bonded so deeply to a particular bearing, a particular scent and posture, that the connection survived generations. The line had been quietly folded into general service stock in the 90s when the budget dried up and the men who understood it retired, were reassigned, or simply vanished into the kind of obscurity that swallowed people who'd done work too sensitive to write down. These dogs, he said, looking at Talon, carry that bloodline 4-5 generations removed. They've never met anyone who spoke that particular language to them. But the body remembers what the mind never learned. When I walked in here, every animal in this corridor felt something it had no name for and no training to process. That's not aggression, Corporal. That's confusion wearing aggression's coat because it didn't have anywhere else to go. The word. Okonkwo's voice was quiet now, careful. Iska means stand down in the oldest sense, not just bodies, minds. Tells them the search is over. The threat's been cleared, they can let go of the weight they've been carrying since the crate door closed this morning. He looked, briefly, almost sad. It's not magic, Warrant. It's just a key nobody thought to keep a copy of. Brant was quiet for a long moment, watching her own dog, Talon, hers since basic certification, the animal she'd have sworn she understood better than her own family, lying peaceful and unguarded in front of a stranger he'd known for 90 seconds. I was about to have you arrested, she said finally, and there was no defensiveness in it now, just plain shame laid bare. I thought you were the problem. You thought you were protecting your people. The old man's voice gentled. That instinct was right. You just didn't have all the facts yet, and nobody gave them to you, because nobody thought you'd ever need them. That's not a failure on your part. He glanced toward Singh, still crouched by Talon's crate, with both hands resting on the wire mesh, like he was afraid to stop touching it. Your reservist there. First thing he did when the dog started up wasn't punish him. He soothed him. Didn't work, but the instinct was sound. That's the foundation everything else gets built on. Don't let anyone train that out of him. Singh looked up, startled, color rushing into his face at being singled out by a stranger who 90 seconds ago, half the corridor had been ready to have removed in handcuffs. Brant straightened her shoulders, found something steadier in her voice. Sir, I have to log this. I need a name, a service number, something for the incident report. Write down that an unidentified civilian assisted in de-escalating a kennel disturbance and declined to provide further information. He picked his satchel back up, settled the strap over his shoulder with the same economical motion he'd used to set it down. That'll satisfy whoever reads it, and it'll have the benefit of being entirely true. He checked a wristwatch with a cracked leather band, the kind of watch that had clearly outlived several owners' patience for buying a new one. My flight's in 40 minutes. I'm meeting my son in Halifax. Haven't seen the grandkids since Easter. For a moment, the weight that had filled the corridor a few minutes earlier simply wasn't there anymore. Just an older man checking the time, thinking about grandchildren, in a slightly worn coat that had nothing left to prove. He gave Okonkwo a small nod, soldier to soldier, the kind that didn't need translating. To Brant, he offered something gentler. Listen to your dogs, Corporal. They'll tell you the truth of a situation a good 10 minutes before any of the people around you work up the nerve to. Then, he turned and walked away down the corridor, unhurried, his boots making almost no sound on the tile, and he didn't look back once. Brant watched him go until he turned the corner toward the escalators and was gone, swallowed into the ordinary churn of travelers dragging suitcases toward gates that had nothing to do with any of this. You won't find him, Okonkwo said quietly, coming to stand beside her. Not in any directory, not in any roster current or retired. Men who did that kind of work, when they were done, the paper trail got buried so deep you'd need clearance 3 levels above mine just to confirm it ever existed. They become exactly what he looks like now. A man catching a flight to see his grandkids. The 6 dogs lay motionless and calm along the wall, Talon's tail giving one last slow sweep against the concrete before he settled fully, eyes drooping, the storm entirely past. The corridor that 10 minutes ago had been a chorus of barking and shouted commands was quiet enough now to hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Corporal Brandt knelt down beside Talon's crate and rested her hand flat against the mesh, the way Singh had earlier, except this time the dog leaned his whole weight gently into her palm. She didn't know the word the old man had used, didn't know if she'd ever hear it again, but she understood, in some way that didn't need explaining, that whatever had just happened in this hallway had nothing to do with regulations and everything to do with something older than her training, older than her unit, older than the building they were standing in. She looked at her dog, then down the empty corridor where the old man had disappeared, and for the first time since she'd put on the uniform, she understood that there was a kind of authority no rank insignia could ever fully account for, and that the real work of leading anyone, dog or soldier, started somewhere past the point where the manual ran out.